Greetings everyone, I'm On My Face, and today is the first Theorycrafting Thursday, and today we're going to talk about what I think is one of the most important things in all of competitive gaming, is how to relate the Triangularity Theory to a certain game. And so today we're going to be talking about the Triangularity Theory pertaining to StarCraft 2. What the Triangularity kind of theory is, it's taken from Crawford's term from game design, where between three units or moves, neither is the strongest. And so, like the classic example, A beats B, B beats C, C beats A, or a rock, paper, scissors is triangular. And this was documented in 1982 of Crawford's research of gaming. And how we're really going to kind of break it down related to StarCraft 2 is I have three distinct categories. And so in the top section we have a nice little diagram which shows the rock beating the scissors beating the paper, and then the paper beating the rock. Very simple standard rules that everyone understands. And just based on observations and playing, I relate StarCraft 2's Triangularity Theory into offense beating powering up beating defense, and defense beating offense. And throughout this, we're going to the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Why we're doing this is because I am a business person, and this is kind of what I do it. And so we just first have all these listing it, and how to even remember it even more is to OP damn it. So you know those are the three categories: offense, power, and defense. And this is strictly kind of theory basing. We're going to be talking a little bit about how to apply it post game and during the game. So just kind of be on the have that in the back of your mind of thinking of that. That was really butchered. But anyway, first we're going to talk about offense. Offensive plays can be related into either rushes, pressure builds, or all-ins. And more specifically, whenever you're like stopping worker production, that's what we're calling it all-in. So it can be a 1-base all-in, 2-base, 3-base, kind of all-in types of scenarios. Some examples of rushes are the 6-pool, a Reaper rush, proxy gate, in which you just build zealots, and really any build that blindly punishes Expo first. We're going to talk a little bit about blind builds, but not too much on this episode, as they do have their place, but it's more statistical playing which should be used in a set of games. Some examples of these pressure builds are kind of the 14 pool, 14 gas ling, or 14 gas, 14 pool kind of ling pressure, and then you expand, and then you can take a third behind it, just based on how much pressure you're doing to your opponent. If you're Terran, you just do a 2 racks, in which you push out with Marines and Marauders really early game. A 3 gate, which you're not completely in the all-in position of a 4 gate, but it's still a much heavier build than just a 2 gate or 1 gate, obviously. And really any sort of harassment. Again, these are just pressure to keep your opponent in the base, and that's what we're defining as pressure in this set scenario with offensive play. So anytime you have like Cloak Banshees or drops through Warp Gate or Metavacs to do any muta harassment, as this is already a common word, we're going to lump that into a pressure build, so we're going to lump that into offensive play. The second of the three that we talked about is all-ins. These could be 1-base Baneling Bus or 2-base Baneling Bus. These can be the infamous Banshee tank timing push that Terrans do, and like the most common example, 4-gate. All of these, essentially, you have to cut worker production at some point, and you are just going to non-stop throw everything you have at your opponent. You're not trying to do some damage and then expand. Usually these types of plays, you're going to try to win the game immediately. Next, we're going to look at the strengths of offensive play. Usually, if you're playing offensively, you're controlling the flow of the game, because you're making your opponent decide, okay, am I going to defend this push? Am I going to do my counter push of my own? Or if I've powered up too much by taking either expansions or upgrading technology too much, I'm essentially dead. And we'll talk about how offense can beat that kind of tech play, which is related to the Triangularity Theory, which we're talking about. Another great strength of the offense is that it beats that greedy play of powering up. For your lesser level players, I'm talking about platinum and probably under and even some diamonds, offensive play can beat very sloppy mechanics. If they are missing warp-ins, rounds of drones, or anything else, larva injects, doing an offensive push even early on or mid-game can punish that. And offensive strength, I put this under strengths, it's usually shorter games. So if you are sitting down and you want to play 10 games really fast, you just want to just get back in a rhythm type of thing, just do an offensive build. That's usually a good way to pump out a lot of games. Some weaknesses, however, of offensive play is defensive play for one. Since offensive play is usually going to try to do a lot of damage, but if your opponent has set up very good defenses, if it being bunkers, photon cannons, spine crawlers, or even more mobile units such as mass zerglings, roaches, banelings, tanks, archons, high templars, may hold off your heavy offensive play. Another weakness of offensive play is if you lose most of your army, you're probably not going to have a very strong follow-up, because usually you're putting in so much effort and time into just having a big army that as soon as you lose it, it's gone, and then you're behind your opponent. A classic example is usually doing a two base mech push versus a Zerg player. As soon as you lose that mech army, it's extremely difficult to rebuild that army if it didn't do enough damage, and so usually the Zerg player is ahead through the rest of the game. If you're doing an offensive play, sometimes you're going to be behind in upgrades. Since you're just making, for example, a lot of naked raxes opposed to your opponent who's getting tech labs and engineering bays, you will be behind on upgrades, but you're going to have more units. And another big weakness that I really want to stress is you run the risk of overproducing lower tier units. These lower tier units are effectively your Marines, your Marauders, your Stalkers, Zealots, Sentries, and the Zergling Roaches. While there are very effective strategies that use a lot of these in mass, sometimes if they go too long by just building up the number and not getting technology or even expanding behind it, you're going to suffer the later and later game as long as you don't do any damage. Some opportunities of offensive play is it punishes that power play. So that is a huge opportunity if I'm deciding to play an offensive mindset. You're able to usually punish a very fast expansion, or if they're getting really greedy with teching up to a tier 3 kind of tech. An example of tier 3 tech is getting a hatchery layer, then hive, like hive tech for Zerg. Pressure builds can buy time for an offensive expansion. What that means is if I'm doing a very say one base push, well, my opponent probably needs to defend that, and so if your opponent is on the defense, then I can expand with almost little repercussions. And so by applying pressure and keeping your opponent in his base, you're able to expand behind it and then get on 2 base and continue a follow-up pressure or a giant all-in push. And again, an opportunity to offensive play is if your opponent has poor mechanics, you usually can win the game. This obviously is more related to lower level leagues, since at the higher level, Diamond and Masters, you probably aren't going to have poor mechanics too frequently. Now, the threats of offensive play is defensive play. So this could be either reactionary based on scouting information, or it could just be a blind kind of counter. A very big thing is in TVT, if they get turrets up even before Banshees are up, and you're going Cloak Banshees, well, already their defensive play is going to set you back, since they're already ready to defend against Cloak Banshees. It is a blind response in a lot of aspects, but you will be behind for that specific game. Another threat of offense play, sometimes you cut workers or even getting more economy, such as more expansions. That's pretty self-explanatory. If you're just building up out of all of your unit producing structures non-stop and you even have extras producing out of it, you are going to cut economy. A big example is in Protoss. If you're doing a 4-gate or even a 3-gate robo, it's extremely hard to keep supporting probes non-stop while doing that type of opening or build. And the biggest threat, which this affects later game, mid to late game, is you're going to drop behind in upgrades. You're going to have this massive army, but the longer the game goes on, if your opponent has not died or hasn't suffered any serious issues, they're probably getting more upgrades, so they're going to be way ahead of where you're going to be for follow-up attacks. Now with that done, we're talking about power, or powering up. And what we're kind of linking powering with is you're either getting early tech, so you're teching up extremely fast, you're taking another expansion, and even developing spellcasters. Since spellcasters, even though they require much more micro intensive, they're extremely important in a wide variety of situations. So first, we're just looking at examples of early tech. That could be getting a very fast lair for Zerg players, a very fast stim or Cloak Banshee type of play for Terran players, to getting really fast DTs, and really any sort of play that gets a very fast +1. Now what I mean by a fast kind of +1 is doing it essentially before the 6-minute mark. If you want to throw out a timing, you can even get it earlier than that or even a little later than that. But if you're sacrificing an expansion or even sacrificing producing units to get that early upgrade, that's considered an early tech power play. Some examples of expanding are getting a 14 hatch, a 14 command center for Terran, and a 15 nexus. Those are all very straightforward of what an early expand is. Of course, you can put your opponent on expanding even later on in the game if you can scout, okay, he's setting up a line of tanks in siege mode more towards his base, he's probably expanding, or he's attacking me right now, he may be expanding behind it, but that's more kind of blind. The best way to know the information is to scout it with either a worker or some sort of observer, overlord, or scan, really. And then finally our spellcasters, and for Zerg there's the Infestor, which is their big spellcaster. For Terran they have Ghosts and Ravens, and for Protoss they have High Templar and Sentries. Again, very easy if you've ever played StarCraft 2 before to know exactly what spellcasters are. Now we're going to look at some strengths with powering up plays. Usually if you're powering up, you're going to have a better mid to late game kind of setup, since you're going to have either a bigger economy or more advanced units to fight your opponents. You're going to have a more diverse opponents because you've teched up to that higher second tier and tier 3 units. You're going to have the better economy, and then of course the upgrades, which very commonly people either write it as UPS or UGS is actually what I prefer, because UPS is used in so many different games that it can be a little confusing, or at least for me. And the biggest example is a 1-up or 1-ups type of thing for Mario type of games. Some weaknesses of power plays is of course the offensive play. If you're trying to get a lot of technology up extremely fast, you're going to be behind, and especially if you get an expansion very fast, you're not going to have as much units, even tier 1 units, to defend an early push. A big example is you're going to be slow to actually get started, and what I mean by started is actually being able to attack and defend any type of pushes. And then usually with power plays, you're more open to any sort of harassment, either it be Hellions, Banshees, Baneling drops, Phoenixes. All this can be considered harassment kind of plays, which was defined under the offensive plays. Some opportunities of power play, though, is that it punishes safe and defensive play. What I mean by safe is when they build a clump of units, but they don't move out. They don't put pressure on because they want their units in a defensive position to then get a second or even to get a third. The big example that I gave earlier was if a Terran player is setting up a tank line at his natural, he's probably not going to push. He's putting it already in a defensive mindset, so you're actually completely safe to cut unit production and either get more technology, either it be +1s or higher tier units, or you can even take another expansion if you feel that safe. Another opportunity of powering up is you can get a giant boost of economy, and I added the if not scouted, since your opponent, if he does scout it, and hopefully talking through this, you can put your opponent saying, wow, he's taking a very fast expansion, I need to punish him because he's playing so greedy. But it is definitely an opportunity of a power play. Some threats of power play is offensive play. So if you're trying to get up to tier 2 or even tier 3 units on one base and your opponent pushes out with a huge clump of tier 1 units, you're probably not going to hold it off. There's very few things that are going to hold it off. A big example is if a Terran player is trying to tech up straight for 2-port Banshee type of thing, they're not going to have a lot of Marines, especially. They're going to have some, and they'll have some bunkers, but you have an opportunity as a Zerg player to then do like a Baneling bust or something like that, because they're going to be so low on tier 1 units that you should be able to just completely just bust them up and completely scoutable, or to a certain degree scoutable, and then you essentially win the game. Some threats with power as well include, it's usually more micro and macro intensive. I think I actually meant to write macro, because you're going to have more things to kind of deal with as the game progresses, rather than just saying I'm going to have a clump of units and I'm just going to 1A towards their base, or I already have a defense set up with photon cannons, I don't have to do anything else because they're always going to be there. And then the last kind of threat that power play leads is you need good scouting information to know when you're able to power up or really do anything. If you just blindly power up, you in most cases are completely open, which is a big reason why I usually don't like going either Nexus first or Command Center first, since what you're really hoping is your opponent doesn't scout it. Because if your opponent scouts it really early, they should be able to adjust their play to punish that. Now we're moving on to our last part of the triangle, which is defensive play. Some examples of defenses are using static structures such as photon cannons, getting detection. Usually you don't need detection when you're attacking or powering up. You get it to not die to a harassment play. And then slow units. Primarily spellcasters, but we'll go into a few examples in a little bit. The first thing, static structures. For Zerg players, we have spine crawlers and spore crawlers. These obviously cost a drone, but when they're out, they cost no supply, and they're able to hold off a lot of early pushes and harassment. A big example is using spine crawlers to hold off Hellions and using spore crawlers to hold off Void Rays. For Terran, we are able to use bunkers and turrets to hold off really big pushes. These bunkers will able to support either 4 Marines without upgrades or 2 Marauders, or a combination of 2 and 1. To hold off any big, like Zealot or 4-gate is what they're commonly used for. Turrets can be used to hold off DT pushes or really any Cloak Banshee pushes. And then for Protoss, they generally have cannons. This is their all-purpose detection and static defense structure. Detection for each race, we have the Overseer. I'm just list the Overseer here because it's a mobile unit rather than the Spore Crawler, which is also which is also a detection. This is going to change in the Heart of the Swarm, but right now Overseers are there. Ravens and orbital commands are able to scan anywhere on the map for 50 energy. These are the tools for Terran units. And then the Observer for Protoss. This is a free cloaked, well, not free, but it is a one supply cloaked unit that is able to fly around and acts as their detector. And the slow units for each race, we have the Infestor for Zergs. I could write Hydras, but usually they're not created too much, and on creep they're exceedingly fast. For Terran, we have the tanks, which usually are slow because they're siege, so they're completely immobile, and Thors. Why I've listed both of these as defensive units, because even if they're used in an offensive manner, on bigger maps, you're able to counter push extremely easy by just circumventing them completely. So they're a slow-moving kind of defensive unit. And if you, of course, get to your opponent's base, if their tanks are in the middle of the field, it's going to take them a long time to retreat back home to defend anything. And then for Protoss, we have High Templar, which are like the slowest unit other than an unburrowed spine crawler. And then the Sentries, which are a little faster, but they are a relatively slow unit. And why they're a defensive unit is because their Guardian Shield is incredible to hold off Marines, and their Force Field to hold off essentially anything. Some strengths of doing defensive play is it's generally the safest. If you open up with very defensive or safe, you're going to hold off very early aggression. A big example is just even using the buildings for Terran to wall off early, to use a little structure and just have one Zealot for Protoss to hold off Lings, and even just to push, and just holds off any kind of pressure builds the best. Of course, they can just retreat, and you'll be alive and they'll be alive, but why they retreated is because you did a defensive play and they knew you had an advantage. Defensive strengths are also you're better off at holding high aggression all in, which I just described. Static buildings don't cost any supply. This is more in relation to using the spine spores and photon cannons, as bunkers don't cost supply, but you need to have units in them to be effective. But they're a huge benefit right there. And the biggest strength really is it makes it scary for your opponents to attack. You want your opponents to kind of look in you or scout you and say, oh god, I cannot attack them right now. And so you can almost force them at that point to take an expansion. Then hopefully you'll have enough mobile forces to then punish that, or at least know that they're attacking, so you know there should be an opening in about 2 minutes, as most command centers or main structures take about 110 seconds, I believe. Some weaknesses of defensive play is if your opponent opens up in a power play. Since you're probably going to set up a lot of spines, spores, bunkers, or photon cannons and be really ready for a push, but if it never comes and then you scout they're on 2 bases already and you're just really devoted to holding off a 1-base push or even a 2-base push and they're taking a third. The biggest example here is in if Protoss Forge Fast expands, the Zerg can then scout the Forge Fast expand and take a third. So that is a direct response of saying you are setting up very defensively. Yeah, you're on 2 bases or setting up for an early expansion, but you're setting up defensively using static buildings. I can take this third and I know you cannot put any pressure on me for a while until you start teching up. The biggest weakness is if you're not attacked, usually you have these wasted resources just kind of sitting around. If you build a lot of missile turrets expecting Cloak Banshees and Banshees never come up, that's a lot of minerals that are just completely wasted that could have been used to even building additional barracks or even another command center earlier. And of course, you can be out expanded if you're playing too defensively. And this is also another huge thing that lower level league players run into, because they always want to play safe, play standard in what they think is their mind. And they'll just completely turtle. They'll be turtled up on one base or two base, and they'll just wait and wait and wait and wait and wait until they're maxed out to 200. But the problem is their opponents have already taken a third and fourth, and so they're able to reach that max supply. And so even if there is a 200-200 army conflict, the opponent will be able to regenerate their army a lot faster than the two base player who opened up defensively. But some opportunities of defensive play is that it completely punishes blind all-ins or offensive play. That's a huge thing, especially for people that go into a game and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to open this game getting a 14 hatch, but then as soon as I get that hatch up, I'm stopping at 14 drones and I'm just making zerglings, type of thing. So if you played a defensive opening, you would extremely be able to stop this, and knowing that you'll be alive even if they throw 20 to 40 lings at you, you should know early on in that game that they have a very low drone count. And in this example, they'll have 14. Oh, this is actually they'll have 14 drones. By the time that they're hitting you, you'll probably already be over 20 workers. And so already there, you're accumulating much more minerals and probably gas. And so your defensive play then turns into a tech play, which then when you move out, they're stuck on a lot of tier 1 units. And so then your tier 2 and tier 3 units completely destroy his army. Some opportunities as well, it sets up this defensive expansion. If your opponent is afraid to attack you and isn't doing a lot of pressure because already you have 3 tanks in siege mode, they're slowly going to retreat, so you're able to take this expansion. It may be later, but it's completely safe. And then safest early options, this is more for if your opponent is trying to do a blind kind of all-in. So if your opponent opens up with either a Reaper Rush or a 6 pool or a 4 gate, setting up already your defenses early on is going to enable you to defend any of that shenanigans. Now, some threats of defensive play is the power play. So anything related to power play, either teching up really fast or getting an early expansion, you're going to be behind if you're already setting up static defenses or getting ready for a big push that never comes, and when you scout, they're all over the map. A huge thing that I think is a defensive threat is you lose complete map control. Since you're making a lot of slow units, a lot of static defense, and even in some situations the detection, none of these usually grant map control whatsoever. You may have some map awareness, but you have no units that are able to run around the map and just clear any units that are away from their main army or scouting parties. And then why you lose the map control is you usually have more poor scouting opportunities, and that's because you don't have those fast units. So what I want everyone to start thinking of is, rather than thinking of a strict build like, okay, I'm going to get supply depot on 10, racks on 12, gas on 13, factory on 19, or something like that. I want you to start looking at builds and how are they opening, and what we're going to look at is opening builds in 2. And we're going to take their first decision and then what they should follow up. So the first on the list is offense. This is essentially these blind all-ins. So like the 6 pool. Excuse me. So a 6 pool would be categorized under this offensive play. An offensive power-up play could be described as like a 3 Marauder push and expanding behind it. 3 Mara FE. Wow, it's extremely hard to write like this. Like a 3 Mara FE would be like an offensive power play. And then offensive defense is usually sending out, like in TVZ, sending your first 7 to 9 Marines. and making siege tanks behind it in bunkers to hold off any aggression. And so now after the offensive first openings, we have the power openings. And so we can take an early expansion and then put on a lot of aggression afterwards. A big example is the 2-base Roach for Zerg. Or really any play that tries to get a very fast expansion and then either a 2-base big push, or all in, could be categorized as a power defensive play. Power, which is like the biggest thing that people call greedy, in which they're either taking 2 really fast expansions at roughly the same time, or they're getting an expansion and tacking up to tier 2 or 3 units, in which they have very little defenses or very little units at all to defend any pushes. This can work if your opponents are playing defensive, but it is extremely greedy, as the general populace calls it. And then we have the power defense play. This could be considered as the standard kind of Zerg play of getting a 14 hatch, and then as soon as the hatchery is complete, to get some spine crawlers up. Spine. I know it's very pretty, but it's what I've got. And so that's the big example right there. And now moving on to the defensive type of 2 openings, is we can set up, what's a good defensive offensive one? I think that was the only one that I had major trouble with. Defensive offensive kind of push is setting up bunkers to block the ramp, and then following up with Cloak Banshees, as Banshees are considered a harassment unit, which puts them under the offensive kind of play style. So you're going to be very afraid to attack a Terran who's sitting on 1 base and has bunkers up already there, and you're going to say, oh, I'll just take an expansion. And then if you're not prepared for it, or if you haven't got an Overlord or an Observer or something of that nature, Cloak Banshees are going to come out to try to do damage. And as soon as the Cloak Banshees are out, then it's most likely that the Terran in this example will expand afterwards. But that's thinking in 3s, and right now I just want to think in 2s of general openings. A defensive power type of thing could be a good example of doing the oh god, I completely forgot the name of it, but it's the cannon FE for toss, in which you forge FE is what it's called. Doing a forge FE in PvZ. So in Protoss, they build the forge extremely fast to start the wall off, to then get a nexus right behind it, and then they rely solely on building cannons to hold off any roach pushes, zergling pushes, baneling pushes, because that's all they have at that time. And then defensive play, which is probably considered the worst, but some people still do it, is in which you rely really any sort of early detection, early bunkers, and that's all you're doing. A big example of defensive play is kind of redundant play, in which you're getting kind of bunkers, and then a lot of tanks early on, in which you're just going to plan on turtling up nearly forever, in which you want that massive 200 army on 1 base, and then you're going to move out. But during that time, your opponent is able to then play greedy, which this is the best kind of defense to it, or best response. If you spot someone playing very defensively, is that gives you the opportunity to play very greedy. And so just to go over the triangle, we know that offense is supposed to be powering up. Powering up beats defense, but defense beats offense. So these are kind of the big 3, and then there's the variations of that you have to consider. So offense beats power up, but if they open up with a power up defense, these two go together. And then of course the offense defense play, offense beats power up, which then beats defense. So you can start to see a little bit how that works. I'm just going to clear this up so I can do a little more examples and have a little more room over here. Can I actually change my ink color? Let's just change it to something not red so it's easier to read. I probably should have done that earlier. Can I go to gray? How does that look? Okay, looks pretty good. And so we've already talked about offense, power, and defense. And that's basically the triangularity theory in this kind of list example. But say if we wanted to open up a Forge Fast Expand, which is a defense power up, defense beats offense, or how do I, yeah, beats offense, which beats powering up beats defense. So an offensive defensive play, it does the best at. But if they were able to do a power up offense, that is your biggest threat right here. Power up offense. This is your biggest threat. And so what you'll see actually very commonly in PvZ taking that Forge Fast Expand is you'll have a lot of Zerg players who power up, who get a 14 hatch, and then do a 2-base timing push of either roaches and banelings, and that's how they try to stop it. So that is a huge big example. But of course they can also just say, okay, you're doing defensive play, well I want to power up, starting from the start, and then I see you powering up, so I'm going to match your powering up. And so this is an example of getting that third hatchery before really doing anything up. So it's a power, so your defense, okay, I'm ahead, power, and this is just kind of canceling out to stay ahead. But that's just a general strategy. You can look at any single race matchup and start applying each of these kind of two style openings. Once you start getting into more complicated play, you can start thinking of builds in 3s and 4s. But in general, a lot of times games just revolve around the beginning 2. And what you really need to start getting into accustomed to is just first placing it either to be offensive, powering up, or defensive. And once you can start singling out a single amount of time in a game, either watching a replay or in the game saying, okay, you take an expansion, already know he's powering up, or I got a scout in, he's getting extremely fast DT tech, he's powering up. So if he's getting DTs very fast, for example, I need to push out very soon, and if I don't have an army because I was playing too defensively or I myself was powering up, I need to adjust my play to that. And so if I'm teching up and I saw DTs, then I'm hoping that my tech up play is going to beat his tech up play. And so it's kind of an even exchange. A lot like if I threw scissors and he threw scissors, it's exactly even. No one would win at that exact time since you're both throwing out the exact same play move. But that's generally how I would start to kind of teach and talk about the triangularity theory related to opening builds. And but my ending thoughts of using triangularity theory is whenever you're stuck in a late game scenario, look at the triangularity of what progressed already throughout the game. So if we saw that he took an early expansion, he did a push, and now he took another expansion, we can put that he powered, he played offensively, and then he powered up again. And so we can start making decisions based on that, of what I need to do. A big example would probably be if he opened up, a Zerg player opened up hatchery first, then he put a little bit of 2-base pressure on, and then he's powered up to start getting Mutilus, for example, in a PvZ. example. So the Protoss player, who probably also opened up power first, getting a forge or defense first, getting a forge up, then he got a nexus. So technically they're even right now, but now that I've scouted that he's also teching up to mutas, I need to either respond to his harassment, since he'll transition to an offensive play after that, to either set up photon cannons, which is defense, which beats it, or setting up stalker armies, which can be used defensively as well. You can also analyze a build using the Triangularity Theory by just watching your replay or just even writing it on paper. This is why the Triangularity Theory is so awesome, is even when you're not playing, you can start theory crafting. And I mean, that's really important, especially since a lot of people can't play StarCraft 2 all day and sit in front of their computer all day and figure out different builds when they're at work or they're on break or really anything else. When they're even in class, they can start sketching out, okay, well, if I open up with if I open up with a lot of Marines and I decide to do a push versus a Protoss player. Now, what timings do I need to beat, or what do I need to observe to know that this push is going to work, or if I need to run away? And so, if my Marines go out and they see a lot of defenses, such as sentries or photon cannons, they probably need to retreat right away. Now, if my Marines move out and they see nearly no sentries, and they actually scout his opponent, the Protoss player, tacking up to getting blink stalkers or charge really fast, they have an opportunity to start doing damage, to either trade their army or even to start damaging some of their probes, and if they have very bad mechanics, to win the game. But that's all you can do at home of just starting to Theorycraft. Yeah, that's more of a higher level thing of knowing builds and knowing times, but that's something that you don't even have to play the game to learn that information. All you need to do is start selecting this into the triangle, which is the offense, power up, defense, or the OP, damn it. Because everything relates back to the OPD. And then making reactionary play. This is more while you're in the game of, say, if you scout a Nexus first, you can immediately make a reactionary play saying, he's opening up, powering up. Right now, all I have is, I went spawning pool first. I can do an offensive push right now and probably punish him for not getting that forge first, not opening up defense first, but opening up a power play. And so thus I'm opening up an offensive play to beat his power play. So you can do a lot of reactionary play on a strategy you've never seen before, as long as you're able to put it in either the offense, powering up, or defensive play styles. Or decisions, I guess. And then the best thing that I use, if I see something completely wacky, is that new build. And I just place it in one of them, and I try to make my decisions off of that. So that's essentially my closing thoughts on the Triangularity Theory. Why I wanted to have this as my episode 1 is whenever I do teaching or whenever I theorycraft anything, I'm going to reference this. I'm going to constantly say, okay, he opened up a very offensive play, and because I scouted it with my SCV or something like that, I knew I had to start setting up a defense. Not completely cut worker production or anything else, but I know I needed to start setting up. Now, if it was just really late and I was about to shit my pants because he had 5 Colossus there and I didn't even have a single Viking, let alone a starport up, probably just going to lose the game, and I'll count it as just bad scouting at that point. But why the Triangularity is so important is it's all revolves around scouting information. So just like in rock, paper, scissors, if we were playing rock, paper, scissors and we went 1, 2, 3 and I threw a rock, then if you threw paper, I would lose. How we're applying the Triangularity Theory to StarCraft 2 is we're doing 1, 2, 3, but if I use scouting information, I see on 1, 2 that you're already throwing scissors, I have, or should have, amount of time to change my decision, if I was throwing paper, to change my decision to stop your decision making, to absolutely just theory-based ways to annihilate your strategy. So for example, if you, I think I used powering up as scissors, if you're doing Nexus first, and I scout it 1, 2, I can adapt my opening, in which I've already opened up a barracks first, so technically that's already an offensive play since it's still playing more standard, and I see your scissors on 2, and I immediately throw down 5 additional barracks, and I'm just going to try to push you, or I start doing an offensive bunker kind of rush to them. That's going to maybe not win me the game outright, but all I'm trying to do is make your decision of making a Nexus first with 0 defenses, 0 offensive units there. I'm going to just try to cancel that. I'm not trying to win the game. I want your first decision to be completely nulled. As soon as that decision is nulled, then I have a slight advantage through the rest of the game. And if I'm able to keep up scouting information and just kind of get that kind of star sense, game awareness down, I'll start making more and more decisions which will put, at a bigger and bigger advantage, in which when it does come to late game, hopefully I'll have either more expansions, more technology, or more units to then completely crush the opponent and win the game. So not a lot of people are here right now, which kind of sucks. Obviously Theorycrafting isn't for everyone, and this hasn't been too much of an open forum type of thing. I will open the floor to questions if anyone has them related to how to spot any certain builds, but they're very specific to what you're doing, which is another thing why I like it. As much as I like rules, well, these are essentially the law that I follow in StarCraft 2. If I scout you powering up, I'm going to attack, essentially. If I spot you doing defense, I'm going to power up. Very seldomly do I spot you doing power up and power up myself. Or if you're building defense, and why should I build defense type of thing. And if you're doing an attack, usually I try not to just do an attack type of thing. And just in general, obviously you want to do the safest play, which then expands to then have a bigger army. But you have to be aware of all of these aspects of having a giant offensive push coming that destroys your power-up play. And so you need to be able to figure out how to stop that, or how you're going to react and make that decision to stop it. Yeah, but I'm just going to call it right here. This, even though it's my first episode, is going to probably be my favorite episode. I'm going to talk about this a lot, reference it a lot, and not only Theorycrafting Thursday, but in any other time that I talk about StarCraft, in a fighting game, anything. The Triangularity Theory applies to any competitive gaming. Even MMOs can even be considered a Triangularity Theory. But I'm just going to close the stream now. Those who tuned in, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you again next time. Peace.